And I think all this is complicated by the fact that people use the term addiction in common parlance in lots of ways that make it seem like addiction. Like people say, I'm addicted to Game of Thrones, you know, and they say that, you know, sincerely, but their conception of addiction is like, I really want to see the show, so I can sort of choose not to see the show, right? And I think one of the things that Art points up in his introduction is how much the physicality of the brain is driving what all of you work with on a regular basis with people who have an addiction in the true physical sense. And I think that's again a way that the word has sort of crept into the vernacular to mean really wanting to do something. And I think anybody who has not felt any kind of addictive tendency, whatever it happens to be, really doesn't have a clear understanding of what that's like, right? I mean, typically, we imagine that our appetitive feelings toward spending time with a person or eating a particular food or having a particular activity or something like that, that those tendencies are generally under volitional control, right? So I can decide not to eat the entire pint of ice cream, or I could decide, you know, to not watch TV tonight, or I could decide even not to have wine with dinner. So the mistake that people make, or I shouldn't say mistake, the misinterpretation of thinking that addiction equates to really liking something a lot is something that unnecessarily, but understandably, confuses the issue when we have people who are not subject to feelings of addiction try to understand people who are. And I think that's a societal issue that makes it that much more challenging, because I think many, even parents who have children who are experiencing whatever kind of addiction, just say, well, just get it together, you know, I mean, just use your willpower and just, you know, buck up and do what you're supposed to do. And, you know, it's interesting, going just beyond the idea of addiction, just issues related to mental health in our country are treated entirely differently than issues related to physical health, right? If someone is suffering from depression, for example, there are all kinds of misinterpretations about that as being something apart from the actual physical body. But as Art and I say all the time, the brain is part of the physical body and vice versa, right? I mean, this is all physical stuff. And so once you start to recognize the fact that the same kind of things that are driving, you know, problems with blood circulation or a fracture in a bone are not categorically different than something that would happen in terms of neurochemistry that would affect somebody's behavior.
So let's dig down now into the brain a little bit more. So I've already said we've got these basal ganglia. They're driving action. Okay, so I usually make a kind of simple distinction between what I've often called the go system and the stop system, which is a reasonable way of thinking about two competing systems in the brain, right? So the go system is the one that engages your goals, gives energy to them, and drives you to act towards them. And over time, you will also begin to associate environments with behaviors in ways that will lead to habits. So a habit is really just a memory of what I'm supposed to do in a particular situation. Now, one of the things that happens when you engage a goal is that when that goal is engaged, you now focus your attention on everything that's related to that goal. So for example, anyone who's ever bought a car knows that when you're looking at a particular model of car, now suddenly you notice everybody else on the road driving the same car, right? Even though you may not have noticed it 3 days before. And it's just because you now have this goal that's active. And of course, you know, someone who's in the throes of an addiction, they have this highly active goal related to the substance they want to use, so that they begin to notice things in the environment all the time related to their addiction, right? So it's not, it goes beyond just, I have this thing I want to do. That thing I want to do plagues that person in everything that they do, because that information is accessible everywhere. They see it everywhere. You know, they'll be watching a television program and there's a bottle in the very background of the show, but it leaps out at them because that goal is active. So we have this go system. And then once the go system is active, left to its own devices, it will tend to drive someone towards the behavior that will allow them to achieve that goal. The only thing standing between them and actually doing something to achieve that goal is a couple of ounces of brain material in the frontal lobes that's part of what I call the stop system. It's an inhibitory system that tries to stop the action that you're trying to perform. And of course, that stop system is impaired by stress and by drugs and alcohol and by overuse, right? And so, which is one of the reasons why you'll see people who are trying to quit smoking cigarettes, in a very stressful situation, suddenly outside with a pack of cigarettes in their hand because they just can't stop themselves from doing it. Now, there's a lot of things that follow from that, but I want to talk about one that's, I think, specific to addiction and relates to what Bob was talking about, which is there are lots of individual differences in the world, in the way that our brains are set up. And one of those individual differences that we don't talk about a lot is what we can think of as the gain or the volume control on the go system, right? So some people we know are just not particularly driven people. They just, you have to set a little thermonuclear device off beneath their desk to get them to do anything. They just sort of left to their own devices, they'll just kind of sit around. They might not even turn the TV on because that would require some amount of effort, right? And then we have other people who are very driven to just engage with everything, right? That knob is turned way up. And when that knob gets turned way up and gets directed towards, say, substances, then it creates a real compulsion to engage with those substances in ways that will overcome the brakes, right? So most people, particularly people who are not suffering from addiction, they might go out and have a few beers and then look and then say, you know what, gosh, it's 9:30 and I gotta start studying, so let me get to work. And that works for them for two reasons. One, because their volume control on the go system isn't jacked up all the way to 11, and the stop system is functioning reasonably well. But if you got that volume control up to 11, then it's really hard to stop, and you can really overwhelm the brakes in ways that then keep you moving down that track. And one of the reasons that this is so important is because it relates to how other people will treat you if you have this, if you're an addict, which is that they say things like, just cut it out, just get a hold of yourself, have some willpower. Well, the people who are saying that, generally speaking, don't have a go system turned up to 11. So they haven't experienced a need driven by brain structures that don't communicate that well with the storytelling apparatus, that are driving you to do things that really feel utterly out of your control, right? For them, everything that they do is something that they could choose to do or not to do because that go system and stop system are balanced well enough that they have what looks a little bit more like volitional choice. And so they truly don't understand what it's like to have this go system that is jacked all the way up.
Yeah. I often ask.
Go.
Go.
No, I completely agree. I study rats, so I completely agree, and I record the activity of these more subcortical neurons, and they're like full blast. And what annoys me a lot is that everybody tries to stop these neurons that are full blast with a top-down approach, cortex down, right? Cognitive behavioral therapy, it's all top down. But if I had a cortex this big, I wouldn't be able to do it. So knowing this,
And compared to the rat, we do.
yes, but even if it were ginormous, we wouldn't be able to stop this amazing growth. So why aren't we focusing more on bottom-up regulation, on inhibiting the go rather than on inhibiting the go from developing? And it can be done with things like breathing, vagal stimulation, other things that will soothe the GO system, rather than saying, just stop the GO system. Well, you know what, if you have this GO system, you could stop it.
Yeah.
And I can just say one thing now,
No,
because I know it's your turn.
no, please.
But I can't stop myself. So I think you're absolutely right. So I did this book 3 or 4 years ago now, called Smart Change. And the whole point about the whole crux of the book is to say, look, here's a very simple way of just thinking about what the brain is doing. Your goal is not to ride the brakes, it's to reprogram the GO system.
Yeah.
And some of that involves how do I find ways to calm activity when it's starting. Some of it is how do I change the environment so that I don't trigger this goal as often. And some of it is how do I then put myself in a situation where I can develop better habits so that what I'm reminded to do in the future is not what I'm reminded to do right now. But it's really all about exactly that. It's trying to do lots of things bottom up to change what the GO system is telling you to do, recognizing that if you ride the brakes, you're doomed to failure, including, by the way, starting with how you define the goal you're trying to achieve, right? Which is to say, most people, when they start off, for example, in addiction recovery, start with what I call negative goals. I need to stop drinking, stop doing this drug, stop. And as soon as you frame it like that, you have almost run yourself off the rails immediately, because what you're doing is framing this in terms of, I've got to tax my stop system that's doomed to failure for all the reasons you were just saying. And so what you have to do instead is to start by focusing on positive goals, meaning actions I'm going to perform in situations in which in the past I did the thing that was part of my addiction.
So do you say there's a certain personality type that tends to struggle more with addiction simply because they have that GO system turned to 11 all the time?
Well, I'm sure I just call it a personality type, but certainly there is a huge genetic component to tendencies toward addiction. But I think an important thing about what Art was saying about where in the brain this is all functioning, I mean, that part of the brain is a much more primitive part of the brain than the cortex. And so that evolved in a way that increased the likelihood of survival for the species, including us, right? And so I sometimes ask people to, hold their breath as long as they can, and they see how long they can hold their breath, and say, well, I'd like you to hold your breath for 3 minutes. And of course, they'll say, I can't hold it for 3 minutes. So I say, okay, I'll give you $20 if you hold it for 3 minutes, And I say, okay, $100. Well, they can't do it. They really want the $100, But that part of the brain is saying, breathe, damn it. You're you're about to lose consciousness, so you breathe. And I think the idea of volitional control is such a prominent fiction in our interpretations of our experience through life, when actually most of our actions through most of every day are running on autopilot, right? And that's why this idea of habits is such an important one when it comes to addiction, because the first thing that has to happen is to develop an awareness of things that you were heretofore unaware of because they were running on autopilot. Right? I mean, as Art was using the word triggers, what are the cues in the environment or the opportunities in the environment that make it more likely that you will engage in some kind of behavior that even your conscious storytelling brain can tell a whole story about why this is going to be terrible, but yet you do it anyway. And again, people for whom addiction has not been part of their life experience find that literally unimaginable. I mean, for everyone who chose their parents wisely and chose their genetic makeup in a very clear way, that is such a foreign idea that having to deal in a situation where, as Art was saying, somebody said, well, why don't you just stop doing it? Is just something that recognizes or illustrates the lack of understanding of things. And one thing I want to say to you about what things in the environment create actions that may be operating below our conscious awareness. I mean, we have learned to survive, as all of our precursor species have learned to survive, because we've developed ways of behaving in certain environments that at one time were advantageous, right? I mean, the reason the fast food industry is so successful is because they understood much earlier in human evolution, salts and sweets and fats were in short supply, so our brains learned very early on, boy, if there's any of that around, shove as much of that in your face as you possibly can. Not imagining that there would be a McDonald's, every 2 blocks. But you know what's interesting? I was just reading in the New York Times this morning some data about health and diet and exercise and those kind of things, and how it differed by the community that you lived in, and how many fast food restaurants were in the community, and how many green spaces there were, and how walkable your neighborhood was. And I think this is just one indicator of how much the environment that we structure influences the things that we do. I mean, we are all fortunate to live in a great city, with a relatively mild climate and a great healthcare system and wonderful restaurants, and it's a healthy city and you get paid off socially for being active and those kind of things. Yeah, so we have it easy, right? But if you're in an environment where all those things in the environment are conspiring against your best intentions that are, in your storytelling part of your brain, well, then it's going to be more difficult to do that. I think what Art's saying about, what your gain control is like on your Go system, that is the part where the genetic component tends to say more about how difficult or easy it is for you to do some things compared to other people's chances of doing something.
And just to amplify one thing on that, just to address something you said, Neville, which is, in many ways, that's what you can think of as being personality. So I think when personality psychologists first started talking about personality, they were talking about answers to questions that people would give that hung together. But I think more recently there's been a lot of discussion about how personality really reflects a lot of what you can think of as default settings of your motivational system in the brain, right? So in some ways, things like that gain being relatively turned up or down is something we would think of as a personality characteristic, and it doesn't create addiction all by itself. I mean, in some ways that the sort of standard personality characteristic most closely associated with that would probably be neuroticism, which is basically a measure of how much activity flows through that motivational system. And all else being equal, you're more likely to see addiction in people who are high in neuroticism than low, but there's plenty of neurotic people out there who are not addicts of anything. They're often still annoying, but they're not.
So, do you want to go ahead? Okay, so I had a question. Okay, so, and we're talking about youth right now.
Yeah.
And, youth and addiction, youth and substance misuse and abuse. And so when we're looking at youth and we're saying that they're in the middle of that development of that stop system, correct?
Yes.
So what I'm thinking is that stop system is developing in them. If they start using, due to our culture of experimentation and kind of an overall, in a lot of cases, an idea that kids are going to experiment, they're going to try something new, they're going to do this, they may try alcohol, and some people think that's okay, some people are complicit in that as well. So what I'm saying is that stop system stops. It stops maturing, especially if they're youth and they're starting into this addiction cycle. Perhaps they're more genetically inclined toward that, right? So then they're moving forward in their development, but that system in their brain is not. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they're growing, their bodies are growing, their brains are changing, they're going through the growth cycles that a normal youth would go through, except for that system up here, that frontal lobe, that's still not developing. So it really makes a lot of sense to me, especially when you see that a lot of addiction starts in youth, that part of the brain has got a lot of catching up to do, even as adults. It's not developing at the normal pace.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Plus, the more that you do early on to lay down a bunch of habit patterns, the more that you're doing to, no matter how much that frontal lobe matures, it's always weaker than that Go system.
Yeah,
and so I was just going to say, so what that means is, even if that matures normally, if you start early and develop lots of pathways for creating bad habits,
Yep.
then it's hard, then it just, you can't get out in front of them no matter how strong the cortex, that
Exactly.
cortical
Right.
system is. And so now, unless you do a tremendous amount of work
Yes.
to reprogram that go system, you're going to keep engaging in bad behaviors. And one of the things that's important to remember is, that I think is really important in this, is that those basal ganglia, they change slowly by design, right? I mean, we actually want to maintain a lot of our habits. We don't want to like go 3 days without doing something, like, you know, like you go on vacation, right? So you have a habit in your house to turn on the light switch in your bedroom, right? Well, if you go away on vacation for a week, you don't want to come back and have to relearn all of your habits for your house. That would be disastrous, right? So those pathways are very slow to change. For good reason most of the time, but what that means is that it can take years to make changes in all of these habits that you've developed, and you know, and so we have a real tension in modern society between our value of freedom and an actual brain physiology that says maybe not all freedom is necessarily in everybody's best interests when it comes to things like addiction, and that's a real tension.
And the only thing I would just suggest to adjust the way you described that just a bit is when we talk about the stop system as a generalized functioning part of thinking, right? I don't think it's exactly the case that the whole stop system doesn't develop. It's just you create a habit. Because I think many people who suffer from addiction, you know, exhibit inhibitory responses in many ways that help them hide their addiction, right? So it's not that they lose all inhibitory responses. I mean, they still have the capacity to do that. It's just, as Art's saying, they develop a habit in a relationship with ingesting a substance or engaging in a behavior, whatever it happens to be, that's the source of the addiction, that now that relationship has been developed, that habit has been developed, and now that's a much more difficult thing to change.
And I'm not a neurologist or anything,
Yeah,
but I'm
no.
thinking, but there's got to be something in there that's slowing down that system. You know, if you've got this one back here going, boom, I'm really developing habits, you know, bad habits or whatever, and this system up here is not developing at its normal pace anyway, so it's going at a slower rate. You know, it's having trouble keeping up, is that?
Well, there's a few other components to this that matter, right? One of which is, you know, it's funny, so the frontal lobes don't fully mature till you're in your early 20s.
Right.
But it's not that the stop system doesn't work at all in teens, but where it seems to be particularly impaired is in social situations, right? So that's the place where, you know, it becomes so easy to go along with what the crowd is doing, and very hard to actually stop that. And you know, you can tell all sorts of evolutionary stories about why that might be the case, but it does seem to be a real issue, which is one of the reasons why, you know, when we talk about the importance of peer pressure when it comes to teens, and, you know, that's why it's so important. It's because it's you know, adults are much better at saying, yeah, I don't want to do that. Go, I'll see you, I'll catch you guys later, right? And teens are just like, I'll be right there.
I had a comment and a question about what you were talking about earlier, the environmental influence. So I'm sure you're familiar with Rep Park, right? The sterile cage environment versus like the social environment with lots of enrichment and toys. And you know, you've also talked about like our storytelling ability and our ability to kind of make up lies, right? That explain things in our lives. So as a person in recovery, I definitely experience this myself, and I know a lot of the people that I work with in recovery have had similar experiences where, you know, we may have actually grown up in Rat Park and may have actually been just fine. But the story we told in our brains was that we were in, you know, the sterile environment, or that it was, you know, much worse in some way. And I'm sure, you know, part of that had to do with our own brain chemistry. But yeah, what would you say to that? What kind of, yeah, what would your comment?
Well, you know, I mean, a phrase that I wish we could expunge from the lexicon is nature versus nurture. As if, which one is it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well, it's both, and they interact. And there's a wonderful phrase, I don't know if Matt Ridley made this up, but he titled his book this, he's a science writer, it was back in the 90s, I think. The book was called Nature via Nurture, right? With the idea in mind that we all are born with a set of genetic potentialities and proclivities and dispositions and whatever the hell you want to call them. But the environments that we live in and grow up in tend to activate some and not others, right? I mean, there are some genes that are known that are associated with violent behavior in adulthood, and some mutations of some particular genes. And if a child is born with that mutation and experiences violence as a child, they're very likely to be a violent adult. Other children who are born with that mutation, who don't experience violence in childhood, are not any more likely to show violence as an adult than somebody who doesn't have the mutation. So it's not that the genes are determinative, right? But they are influential in relation to the environment. And I think, you know, I think that subtlety is lost in many discussions when we say nature via nurture. You know, well, that's just your genes. Well, there's nothing that's just your genes. Well, okay, your eye color is. You know, but there are most things about our lives and the way we behave are not just our genes. It's our genes in combination. And I don't think anybody could ever look at most pairs of identical twins and interact with them and think genes are determinative, right? In fact, I don't know of anybody who's raised more than one child can think genes are determinative, right? Because, I mean, how could those kids be related to each other, you know? And they grew up in the same house and all that kind of stuff. Well, because there are many influences that are interacting with our genetic predispositions that combine to make us who we are, and that's a more complicated story than I think most people enjoy hearing about.
And then I just want to say, then there's another piece to this too that I think matters, which is, I often refer back to the old joke, how many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is one, but the light bulb has to want to change. Right?
I laugh at that every
I know. I never get tired of it. But one of the reasons that matters, related to what you were talking about, is, you know, one of the other things about the GO system is it influences our emotional reactions to things. So when you're, you know, if you have something like in an addiction for at least some significant period of time, you want that substance, right? You want to engage with that, and so you know, you're now looking for reasons to want to interact in the way that you have in the past, and so now all that storytelling apparatus is in service of trying to help you to achieve this goal that the GO system has set for you. And so part of what you start to do is, and at that, you know, and if you look at, for example, you know, there's the sort of stages of change models, right? And you know, when you're you know, early on in addiction, you're just like, I just want to do this. But then there's this stage, right, where people are like, I know I shouldn't be doing this, and I know this isn't good for me, but I still want to do it. I'm not ready to stop. And that's where